and investment would be close to double of the average of previous years, a feat never achieved earlier. यात्री की गरिमा, रेल की गति, राष्ट्र की प्रगति. This budget will document a journey of transformation, the journey of a nation by touching millions of human lives daily. We propose to introduce Antyodaya Express, a long-distance, fully unreserved superfast train service for the common man to be operated on dense routes.
Well, Suresh Prabhu has presented his second railway budget. Lots of ambition, some hits and some misses as well. We're going to decode and analyze the railway budget that was presented in Parliament today and the implications it has, not just for that mammoth organization, but also for the Indian economy. Joining me, as always, a power-packed panel. Nalin Jain joining us here in Delhi, the President and CEO of G Transportation and G Aviation. Also with us, Rajeev Jyoti, the Chief Executive Railway Business at Larsen and Tubro. Abhay Agarwal, the partner and PPP leader at EVA. And shortly we'll be joined in our Bangalore studio by Bharat Salotra, the Managing Director of Alstom Transportation. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18. Let me start by getting initial reactions to the railway budget. As I pointed out, some hits, some misses, a lot of honest intent and a lot of continuity from what the railway minister had said in his previous budget that's been taken forward this time around. Let me start by asking you.
Well, as I said, his intent of making bigger investment than what he done last year, I think is a very strong positive sign that he's got support from people who matter, the Ministry of Finance, the Prime Minister. I think all of them appear to be conscious that railway is an area where if you move this, it can also crank the economy, which is having its own challenges. So I see this as a positive introduction into trying to push the economy forward. A 1.2 lakh crore investment over 100,000 crore investment of last year, I think is surely a sign which signaling the strength of railways.
Okay, so you're saying that this could have a multiplier impact as far as the economy is concerned, but the railway is also an indicator of the state of the economy, and that doesn't show you that the core sector is kicking in at this point in time. If you look at what's happened as far as the traffic receipts are concerned, they're up to about 5% at 1.67 lakh crore rupees instead of the targeted 16.9%. Freight, passenger, both down below the budgeted estimates.
You are absolutely right. Railways reflect the health of economy. Both the freight sector particularly reflect how things are moving. The fact that the coal and the food grains, which account for nearly 60% of the freight traffic, have gone affected, which means that the power sector is also depressed. But having said that, you had two choices. One is to start looking back. The other is to see that can you kickstart that. Yeah. And the investments essentially are a direction that you want to kickstart that, try another time, push investments, see whether these can have a multiplier effect in future.
Okay, let's talk about that 1.2 capex plan that the railway minister, lakh crore rupee capex plan that the railway minister has articulated today. And the larger questions are, where is this money going to come from? And they've given a sort of broad breakup: multilateral funding, the gross budgetary support, the EBR, and so on and so forth. And of course, a lot of emphasis this time around on non-tariff revenue. In fact, the railway board chairman, just speaking to us a short while ago, said that he expects at least 10,000 crore rupees in terms of non-tariff revenue this time around. What do you make of that?
So I think, look, as far as the investment is concerned, I would first comment that the whole plan which he laid out last year, he seems to be executing that. So he committed 1 lakh crore last year, and he's done that. He's doing 1.2 lakh crores this year. And this just shows the commitment for solving the long-term issue which railways have had in the last 20 years. Now, coming to your question on funding it, I think he's been working pretty hard on that front, and you named some of the paths and channels he's looking at. But one of the things which I think they're trying to change is also to get the states involved. And you know, the states are getting pretty competitive against each other right now.
That's right. He said that 16 MOUs have already been, 6 have been inked and 16 they're hoping will be tied up.
So I think there's funding going to come from the states, because states are getting aggressive on getting industrialized, getting more manufacturing into their own state so that they can create jobs and so on and so forth. The other channel which you talked about, which is I think can be a very attractive opportunity, is ancillary revenues, as I call them, which is, and he talked about some areas which they would go after. They've got large land parcels, which could be potentially used for horticulture, which could be used for solar power generation.
Sure.
They've got large spaces which can be offered up for advertising. And you know, airline industry, I'll use that as an example. Some of the airlines who are doing well actually have a large
absolutely.
amount
The
of
ancillary revenue is kicking in.
Yeah.
I mean, my conversation with SpiceJet just yesterday, they said it's now 16% in terms of revenue.
So I think, I mean, if they plan it well, because of the number of people who travel on trains, 23 million people all put together, there is an opportunity here which could be converted from a space utilization standpoint.
Okay. Abhay, you know, how does the math add up as far as you're concerned? And there's also been effort made by the minister and his budget team to try and improve on efficiency, to try and bring down costs. What do you make of the number that they've presented?
So if you see the revenue side, I think they have kind of taken into account about 10% increase. And 10% increase because the fare and freight have not gone up this year, at least now. During the year it may be affected, we don't know. So he is expecting a 10% increase in the freight. And historically speaking, railways has not been able to get more than 6 to 8%.
No.
So
even in FY16 it's barely 5%.
Yeah. So it will also be factor of two things, buoyancy in the economy, and when you are talking about economy, it has to be mineral and manufacturing, because railway doesn't carry any, you know, service goods. It is largely manufactured goods. So that has to go up. And second thing is the railway capacity to carry, which has also been a constraint, in particularly on high density routes. Having said that, I think the overall emphasis on creating capacity is something which is very good, because railways has not been investing for many years, and since last year it has started investing in investments and creating capacity, which is right thing to do if you see the national perspective. Second thing is increasing revenues and reducing cost is something it has to be continuously on. And if you see on corporate side, they always do, they call it performance improvement. And this is something railway has started, so hopefully it will continue to do well on this.
You know, since we were talking about freight, and I just want to get a quick comment from each of you, they've decided not to touch rates at this point in time, and I would imagine that's because they hope to set up the Railway Development Authority. And a conversation that we had with the Niti Aayog member Bibek Debroy, who's been working very, very closely with Suresh Prabhu, and he seemed to suggest that before the legislation actually goes through Parliament, which may take very, very long, the government may introduce this through an executive order, and perhaps the tinkering of tariff or passenger fares could happen at the time when this body comes into existence. What do you expect, and do you believe that we are likely to see a downward revision on freight rates anytime soon?
I do not think I will see it anytime soon, but the realization that freight rates are very high, I think is very clear to everybody. But the fact remains that till you segregate freight traffic and passenger traffic, till you get more market share into freight, a reduction in that will only hit your bottom line even more.
Okay.
And therefore, the projects which are highly driven by freight and passenger separation is critical. The fact that some of these projects are going to start working hopefully by 2019, segregate the two and hopefully allow people to start looking at revision in freight traffic, freight, and perhaps more rationalization and therefore reduction. So I do not see it happening very soon.
You don't see that happening very soon. Would you agree?
I would agree with him, because I think the simple reality is freight reduction is not going to cause more traffic to come in, because for that you need efficiency, you need speed and everything else. But I think what he's trying to do, which is a smart thing, is to expand the basket of products which are carried by the railways. So he talked about the auto car hub, the first of its
in
kind
Chennai, that's right,
and he's talking about cold storage. So those kind of approaches would expand the basket, and if they solve the speed issue, we talked about by 2020 they may take it to 50 kilometers an hour, then you could see overall absolute numbers going up, which would lead to more revenue. Okay,
let me also bring in Bharat Salota, the Managing Director of Alstom Transportation, into this conversation. Bharat, appreciate you joining us. What would your key takeaway be from Suresh Prabhu's second railway budget?
Thanks, Shireen. First of all, I think it's a very customer-centric budget. That's something that we haven't seen for some time. There is focus on safety. There is focus on, on the entire passenger experience. I think this is central for Indian Railways if they have to move forward. It also, in a way, sets the pace for Indian Railways to start looking at their fare structure. Because today, I mean, just as Nalin was saying, the fare structure, as we all understand, all know, that, Indian passenger fares are actually among the lowest in the world. Our freight fares are among the highest in the world, and at some point that correction needs to happen. And in my view, of course, the coming of the DFC will make a substantial difference. But even before that, I think what we should be looking at and will happen, I'm sure the government and the Ministry of Railways is looking at it, is to link the quality of service with the fare structure, and to have one single fare structure, for example, based on the commodity that is carried, needs to change. Perhaps once the DFC is there, where you have a short transit time, better reliability, it will make a big difference. So that's on the customer experience. The other aspect, the focus on investments, I think is very central, because for several years now, several decades, we have seen the government of India and the Indian Railways being underinvested, and I think that's a positive thing. Then for me, it's always a challenge of how well we can execute the projects, and I think that requires some major initiatives. We've seen Vivek Debroy submitting his report. Some of those initiatives, I think, they need to be taken to put a structure in place which follows the overall strategy which the government and the minister is trying to put in place. And if we don't put that structure, we may feel somewhat challenged in our ability, or in Indian Railways' ability to deliver on all the promises that have been.
On balance, what I'm hearing from all four of you is that he has delivered on his promise. So you're not a disappointed lot. You're a happy or a satisfied lot. Satisfied or happy?
Pretty satisfied.
Pretty satisfied. Pretty
satisfied.
Okay. All right. Satisfied to pretty satisfied. That's the verdict here. We are going to take a quick commercial break and come back and discuss the railway budget and the implications for the economy. Welcome back. You're watching the CNBC TV 18 special. We're decoding Suresh Prabhu's second railway budget as he continues his attempt to try and bring the railways out of what he calls is a vicious cycle of underinvestment. One of the other big positives of the railway budget was, and Bharat alluded to that, of course, is the progress as far as the dedicated freight corridors are concerned. The minister saying that in the last 2 years, contracts worth 24,000 crore rupees have been awarded against 13,000 crore rupees in the previous 6 years, and now he's also set his sights on 3 more freight corridors. What did you make of the plan as was articulated today? And are you seeing visible changes on the ground?
Yeah, first and foremost, we are very actively involved in the dedicated freight corridors. As you are aware, we have from within L&T in the last about 2 years got over 18,000 crores of contracts in the western and the eastern side. So we are executing that. So we see action on the ground. But having said that, the 3 additional freight corridors announcement was frankly a surprise and beyond my expectations.
Okay.
I was expecting one additional corridor, but he said 3. When I said 3, which means roughly about 5,000 kilometers, the current 2 corridors is about 3,300 kilometers. So put a value to this 5,500 kilometers, it could be anything in excess of 2.5 lakh crores.
Wow.
So that's a big one. It's not going to happen tomorrow. But as I see, this is very clearly part of his focus on getting to 8.5 lakh crores projects. He's not yet talked about when, but I think the fact that
that was part of that 5-year plan that he presented.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the fact that he's now announced the 3 corridors, I think it's very clear that he is getting towards committing this 2.5 lakh plus crores of these 3 contracts. And this is big news for infrastructure industry.
Big news for infrastructure industry?
Of course, I think it is, and it just, if you create the infrastructure, then it spurs all the other investment which is needed in technology, rolling stock, and all the associated activities. So I honestly think he's right. I think one thing which he's done very consciously since last year is to try and shift the focus a little bit more towards freight, which was not happening in the past because it was very passenger focused.
Yeah.
And that's what is making things happen, like the dedicated freight corridor or the big locomotive projects which were announced last year. So I do think that's the focus.
Okay. Abhay, how would you react to the plans that were announced?
The whole plan for DFC is that, the freight is not able to move freely on the existing corridor because there is always a precedence for the passenger train. And that's why you have average speed of 25 kilometer per hour of the wagon.
As opposed to the 50 that we would like to see,
And on dedicated freight corridor, it will run at 100. So that is one part of it. So you can actually transit now in between Delhi to Bombay in 10 hours.
But are any of you surprised? He didn't really say very much on the high-speed train project at all. There was one odd reference. There was a reference, but didn't spend too much time on it at all. Surprised by that?
I'm not surprised because what so far happened is really a, I would say, quote unquote, a financial closure. Is going to take at least 2 years more. You may first have to appoint consultants who will then start doing the actual detailed work. Then the tendering will perhaps happen in a year and a half, 2 years from now. And therefore, having set that footprint, I don't think he could have said he's going to start placing orders, start placing execution. I would say that the earliest execution you could see, early execution is about 3 years from now.
3 years
so I think it would have been too premature for him to
have said.
underline that.
Okay. Sorry, Abhay, I interrupted you.
And the second, the issue with the DFC is that it has very low operating cost. So the per unit cost of freight movement is very low in a dedicated freight corridor versus in the existing conventional corridor.
Okay.
So when you want efficiency and you want reduced cost for freight movement and you want lower fare, you have to have dedicated freight corridors.
Okay. All right. And we are likely to see 3 more of them as the minister has promised today. But Bharat, let me ask you, because one of the other announcements that he made was this putting together of this national railway plan, which in his words is going to be a seamless way of integrating the multimodal transport system in this country. What do you make of that? And he's also invited suggestions because he believes it has to be a creative partnership. But what would you like to see as being the important, crucial ingredients of that plan?
So Shirish, before I come to that, I'm tempted to talk a little bit about the dedicated freight corridor, put on my earlier hat.
Do.
So if you permit. So, for me, the dedicated freight corridor, of course, focuses on freight, but by default, it also forces a towards, it also brings into focus the passenger side, because there will be a fair amount of capacity which will be released from the existing the passenger freight network, which is currently mixed, as I heard a friend say that the average speed is 30 kilometers. By diverting those trains to the freight, it gives the Indian Railways a great opportunity to start then working in a very focused manner on developing customer-centric solutions in terms of reliability, in terms of transit times, in terms of speed. And that is something that, the first dedicated freight corridor is going to get handed over by 2018, 2019 framework. So it's time, it's also a good opportunity to start looking at how the rail is going to utilize that residual capacity which will get shifted. And it would be a great opportunity to introduce faster trains even on an existing network and all of that. Coming back to the subject of logistics, I think it's again a fantastic initiative in my view, because transport is pretty much commoditized in a sense. By setting up this initiative, it also signals at least a revised thinking on moving away from being a transport solution provider to an end-to-end solution provider. And today in a country which spends almost like a significant part of its GDP, if you compare, on logistics in comparison to the developed world, it should help a more fluidity into the system, a more seamless flow of information, of flow of goods and materials from production centers to consumption centers. Railways is very well positioned to take the lead in this one, since a significant part of the network carries is with them. It also would give an opportunity to Indian Railways to improve their market share, which we have seen over the last several decades has actually been going down at a very quick pace. So it would improve the market share. Then it would have its own impact on environment and all of that. All the associated positive impacts that could come, plus the multiplier effect that we heard. The multiplier being 8 to 9 times for railways. So all in all, I think this is a very good initiative. Yeah.
Okay, like the Prime Minister, the Railway Minister also had lots of acronyms and buzzwords in his speech. Let me ask you about this business of reorganizing or restructuring the Railway Board. And this has been a demand that has been on the table for several years. He didn't spell out the details or what they intend to do, but we've seen several committees suggest what ought to be done. What would your expectation be?
I think if I were to look at structure from a strategy perspective, and I think right now his strategy is broad-based, but I cannot visualize the structure when he said business lines. He still has not defined business lines in the sense which will then further help him to work out a structure.
Okay.
He has said he will break the silos, which are things which happen. But I think unless you are very clear what kind of business lines you want to put, he has focused on manufacturing, for example, and I think all said and done, railways are not in the business of manufacturing, but he said we will manufacture. So you have all the issues which exist in railways. You need to be clear what is it that you want to do as a long-term vision,
Okay.
and that will help you to strategize. Right now we are essentially focusing on debottlenecking, essentially focusing on expansions, but right now is your vision, as Bharat said, end-to-end. If your vision is end-to-end, then you may have to define your structure accordingly. I still don't see how that is being defined from a strategy perspective and a structure perspective.
Bharat, would you agree with that?
Hello?
Bharat, would you agree with that?
As I said, the structure that needs to be put in place must follow the overall strategy. And the strategy in turn must be in line with the overall vision. I mean, this is not just theory. It needs to be put into operation, into practice. I think the railways needs to have maybe a next 10-year, 15-year, 20-year vision, and then start to operationalize it through the 5-year plans, which in turn then get reflected in the year-to-year budget. So clearly, the structure that needs to be put in place must be aligned to the strategy. And today, I think there's a bit of a disconnect. But I think again, there is a strong effort put by the government, by the minister through the Vivek Debroy committee
Perhaps we're
report.
moving towards convergence.
Yes, there is some convergence. I think there is a general recognition today that the structure needs to be set up in a place so can execute all the initiatives that are being proposed.
Okay, as people who are operating in this space, in this sector, what's your sense? When we talk to the guys in the road and highways sector, there seems to be a visible and very perceptible difference on the ground. Are we beginning to see that yet as far as the railway sector is concerned?
I think so, and I mean, a lot has happened in the last 1 year. I mean, look, there are always two elements of a problem, right? One is what you are trying to do for the long term, and as we've discussed in the last 15-20 minutes, there are a ton of things which are happening on the ground, on the long term, whether it was the dedicated freight corridor contracts or the locomotive factories or delegation of authority down the line. So all of that is starting to take root, but I think it's linked
So are
to
you
again,
seeing speedier implementation and execution?
I think so. I mean, we would have never, I mean, from G standpoint, I mean, the project which we won last year would have never happened
you've been
in 6
waiting
months.
for over a decade now, so it's finally...
And it happened in 6 months, flat. One date did not move forward by a day. So I think the speed is coming in. But going back to the comment around the structure and the organization, I think he talked about 3 or 4 things today. One, he mentioned the Debroy report, right? The Debroy committee report. He talked about creating cross-functional directorates.
That's right.
So he's trying to break the silos.
Yeah.
The third thing which he talked about was really the mission-based teams which he's forming on 7 or 8 initiatives.
7 or 8 missions,
right?
yes.
So there were some, thoughts around how do I make this more focused, more accountable, more result oriented, but it's not called the full distance because again this is a legacy organization which has existed in the structure for 100
and it's not
years.
easy to turn it around in a matter of a year or so.
I mean, even in private sector it would have not been easy, so it cannot be different in the railways.
Absolutely. So let me start by getting wrap-up comments, and Abhay, let me ask you, because the minister continued to emphasize that he's not in the business of starting new services and so on and so forth, even though he has announced a few. But if this were to be a budget about ruthless implementation, what are the 2 or 3 things that you would like them to focus on?
I think reduction of trains, merging of trains, reduction in type of rolling stocks, and creating more speed, because unless you do all of it, you can't achieve more speed.
Sure.
So that is one. Second thing is that how to make organization more agile. So I mean, some of these directorates, etc., okay, but in terms of you have to have a separate balance sheet for freight and passenger. That is first. And asset holding has to be separate.
Yeah.
Some of those things
They
have to
talked
be...
about that holding company structure.
So I think we should see some of these things more going forward so that the accountability is complete. And when railway says that we are losing so much on passenger or...
Right.
Third thing, I think railway should get out of cities, metros, Calcutta, Chennai, because this is not their job. If you invest in one city, you are being unfair to other cities.
Sure.
So this should be demerged into separate companies and city should take care of it.
Okay, that's a good idea. Final word to you, Rajeev. We're running out of time. There are questions on how do you finance all of this? It's great to put 1.2 lakh crore rupees as the capex plan, but how do you finance it? If you look at the GBS number last time around, 40,000 crores, you only got about 32,000 crore rupees. He's talked about bonds, the masala bonds. He's talked about LIC and that 5-year funding plan with LIC, state government MOUs. But are you going to be concerned about how the money is put on the table?
I see 2 elements in that. his capability or ability in the short term to generate internal revenues, internal accruals is rather low. You can see that the trend is down from what he had planned and what he is actually achieving and what he is actually going to achieve even next year.
Sure.
So the internal accruals are pretty low. He's going to look at more and more of external borrowing, EBR as they call it, which includes bilateral, multilateral, pension funds, innovative funds,
Sure.
all the stuff, PPP, that's it, all put together. It has been accounting for 40%, I will say it will go up to 60%.
Okay.
And therefore the balance of it has to be GBS. And now GBS is a challenge, that's why I'm saying he seems to have a support of the ministers, therefore he's perhaps looking at GBS of 40%, 35 to 40%
Okay.
on an enlarged investment scene. So I think that's where it looks to
Okay.
be as of short term. But before I close, on the execution side
Yes.
of word, I think important also is that we need to change the mindset of people. The railways are pretty much entrenched in what they do. When we are doing projects of such magnitude,
Right.
we will need to see how we actually allow the stakeholders to proceed in a manner which does not get back to the old paradigm.
Absolutely, and we hope that we only move forward and not take a step backwards. But gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC TV 18 to decode Suresh Prabhu's second railway budget completely out of time. We'll be right back with you right after the break.